for other purposes, signed by 18 senators. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S. 1238, a bill to amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 to extend the current reduced interest rates for undergraduate federal direct Safford loans for 1 year, to modify required distribution rules for pension plans and for other purposes shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Thank you, ma'am.
Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Balkus. Mr. Bekich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative. Senators voting in the affirmative. Blumenthal, Brown, Donnelly, Durbin, Hagan, Heitkamp, Kane, Murray, Reed of Rhode Island, Tester, and Whitehouse. Senators voting in the negative. Alexander, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Cornyn, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, King, Manchin, Portman, and Rubio. Mr. Coates? No. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell? No. Mr. Beckidge? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Bennett? Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins? No. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? No. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Mr. Corker? No. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Harkin? Mr. Harkin? Aye. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Cowan? Mr. Cowan? Aye. Mr. Roberts? No. Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Cochran? Mr. Cochran? No. Mr. Coburn? No. Mr. Heller? No. Mr. Cruz? No. Mr. Franken? Aye. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota? Aye. Mr. Enzi? No. Ms. Landrieu? Ms. Landrieu? Aye. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Crapo? No. Mr. Risch? No. Mrs. Boxer? Aye. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Fitter? No. Mr. Hatch? No. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mr. Wicker? No. Mr. Johans? No. Mr. Heinrich? Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy? Aye.
I'm here till 1. Okay, great. Thank you.
Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Hoven? No. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? Aye. Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Graham? No. Mr. Flake? No. Mr. Shelby? No. Mr. Chambliss? No. Mr. Rono? Aye. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Nelson? Aye. Ms. Ayotte? Ms. Ayotte? No. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Cardin? Aye. Mr. Kirk? No. Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Chiesa? No. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. McCain? No. Mr. Barrasso? No. Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Mr. Rockefeller? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein? Aye.
Should just be Menendez.
Any? Mr. Menendez? Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Thune? No.
Ms. Murkowski?
No.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed of Nevada? No.
Should I do it now? Oh, yeah.
Lee.
Any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 51, the nays are 49. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to.
I enter a motion to reconsider the vote by which cloture was not invoked.
The motion is entered. The senator from Florida. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander?
Mr. President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. President. I asked to be recognized to speak.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I've asked to vitiate the quorum call, Mr. President.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, last week, 40,000 students...
The Senate will be in order. The senator from New Mexico.
Last week, Mr. President, 40,000 students in my state got some very bad news. The rates on new Stafford student loans doubled, and today these students got bad news again. Today our nation's students are once again, they wait in vain for relief. These students work hard, they're ambitious, they know how important a college education is, they know what it means to their future and to our nation's future. They expected more of us, and I share their disappointment. We saw this coming. This bus has been approaching a cliff for a year. That ought to be time enough to turn it around, and turn it around without throwing students underneath it. I know that many of my colleagues here are trying to find a long-term solution. But today we fail, and our nation's students pay the cost of that failure. For so many in my state, grants and loans make the difference. Federalized subsidized Stafford loans are absolutely crucial. Opening a door to college, to opportunity, to investing in the future. We all know these students. Most have lower incomes and fewer advantages. We ask them to work harder, and now we ask them to pay more. They are folks like Lori Cole. Lori was quoted in the Las Cruces Sun-News. She said, "I'm almost 50 years old and returned to school last year. I had to take out loans on top of my grants. I don't like the rates going up, but what can I do? I have a teen in college and a mortgage. I have no choice but to continue with my student loans if I ever want to make more than $10 an hour." They are folks like Josh Dunn. Josh wrote the following on his Facebook page. "As a disabled combat vet, my wife and I, who are both students, do not have a choice but to eat the increase. I don't understand how they can continue to raise the rates on us, not only for tuition, but now also the loan rate, and expect the amount of students to continue to go to school. Hope they can figure it out for our future." I say to Josh and to so many other students like him, I hope we can figure it out too. These students are struggling. Our economy is slowly recovering. Now is not the time to set up more barriers. Now is not the time for interest rates to double. Weighing down students, weighing down hardworking families, weighing down the middle class. The Keep Student Loans Affordable Act of 2013 would have helped, keeping the interest rate at 3.4% for new Stafford loans for 1 year, and giving Congress time for a broader solution. Because the problem is not just interest rates, it's the growing burden of student debt. Higher education is at a tipping point, and we need a long-term plan, a plan that is sustainable, that is comprehensive. These are complicated questions. They require careful answers. But one principle should be clear. For fairness, for investing in our nation's future, college should be within the reach of all American families, not just the privileged few. Students know how to set goals. They know how to set priorities. They expect the same of us. And priorities come down to choices. The Keep Student Loans Affordable Act offered a choice to help students to work towards real solutions, and we could do it by simply closing a tax loophole. No new tax, no new debt, just closing a tax loophole. Not exactly a radical notion. I will do all I can to ensure the Senate will find its way to long-term answers. We will not give up on this issue. 7 million students and their families are waiting for predictability, waiting for more affordable education, and control of spiraling costs. They and their families do the heavy lifting. Every day, we should lend them a hand. The average college senior has over $26,000 in debt at graduation. Some have much more. The burden is heavy enough. We should not be adding to it now. Mr. President, I yield back.
Mr. President.
The senator from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for this opportunity to speak on this issue, which is clearly important to millions of Americans, and one that I'm too familiar with. I think I've shared this in the past personally, but I'll share it again. Obviously, my parents didn't make a lot of money, so I would not have gone to college. I would not have gone to law school had it not been for federal financial aid, both in the form of Pell Grants and loans and work study. All of these programs opened that door for me. And in fact, I don't think any of my siblings could have gone to college without some assistance. But the point is that I know how important these programs are to Americans. In fact, when I was elected to the Senate in 2010, I still had a student loan that was over $100,000. And I was fortunate enough to, as I've said this publicly, write a book, which is now available on paperback if anyone's interested. With the proceeds that I made from that, I was able to pay off that loan. Had it not been for that, I'm not sure when I would have paid off my student loan for law school, because it was over $100-something thousand. Early on, when I had multiple student loans from both undergrad and law school, and the private loans I had to take out for the bar study, there were months where my student loan payments were higher than anything else I was paying. At its peak, it was about $1,400 a month. And that's with a graduate and a law degree and making what most people would consider as a pretty good living. Even with that, it was a real load. Now, obviously, that's at the high end of the spectrum, but even if you talk about the average student loan debt in America today being around $25,000 or $26,000, the evidence is clear that this is having an impact on graduates. So you graduate from college, you have the student loan debt around your neck, and it actually prevents you from doing things like starting your life, buying a home. In some instances, if you fall behind on your payments, it starts to hurt your credit rating. And the evidence continues to grow that a significant percentage of young Americans is facing a challenge that no Americans before us has faced with regards to this sort of student loan debt that hangs over their neck. So clearly we need to have to figure out a permanent solution, not a one-year solution, but a long-term solution on the issue of student loan rates. That's important, and that's an important part of this debate. But here's what I think is missing in this debate, and that is an open acknowledgement that what we have today in higher education as it is currently structured is becoming increasingly and inexplicably unaffordable. And that's the part that isn't being discussed here. The fundamental problem here isn't the loans. The fundamental problem here is the tuition rates that continue to climb across this country. In fact, according to the Wall Street Journal today, institutions of higher education, they grew their revenue faster than inflation from 2005 to 2011, and of course the spending also grew. How many other parts of our economy grew their revenue and their spending at a pace faster than inflation over the last decade? The evidence is that every time we increase the amount of student aid that's available in both Pell Grants and in loan programs, that's just eaten up by a higher tuition rate. Now, as a former state legislator in Florida, that was a battle we had every year because the universities said they needed higher tuition in order to retain quality faculty, et cetera. To some extent, I imagine some of that is true. But at the end of the day, there comes a point, especially in our public institutions, where quality but also affordability have to meet. We cannot continue to price people out of higher education in this country because it's inextricably linked to our future well-being. You know, there's two fundamental problems that face our economy. Number one is we don't have an economy that's growing fast enough, producing the kind of middle-class jobs that allow people to have the kind of lifestyle all Americans want. But the other problem is we have a skills gap in America, where a growing number of people simply have not acquired the skills they need for 21st century middle-class jobs. And the only way to close that skills gap is through education, and particularly higher education. What I would argue today is that the model of higher education that we have in place today, largely based on 19th and 20th century models, is broken. It no longer lives up to the reality of the 21st century. For example, many of the higher-paying jobs in the middle class today don't require a four-year degree from a liberal arts college. They require less than 2 years or a two-year degree program that you could get at a community college. There are other things available to us in terms of how we can incentivize or reform our higher education programs. We should look at accreditation reform. Right now, in order to get student loans or federal aid from the federal government, you have to go to an institution that's accredited. And traditionally, these are the traditional 4-year institutions or a 2-year institution. But there are now alternatives available to us, things that we weren't doing a few years ago. Number one, we should rely increasingly on community colleges, which, by the way, are really a treasure in this country. The services that community colleges provide students to get some of those 2-year degrees. In fact, some community colleges are in the 4-year degree program, and they have tailored programs that allow people that are working to go to school and get this while they can continue to work. That's an important part of the backbone. It's also an extraordinary part of retraining people. You might have a job, and all of a sudden that job just doesn't exist anymore, and you're going to have to go out and get retrained in a new skill or a new trade. The community colleges are an important part of that component. It goes beyond that, though. Career and technical education. For the life of me, I do not understand why we have stigmatized that in this country. Why we've created this idea that unless you get a 4-year degree or more, that you're somehow not successful. When we know that we have a shortage of people that we need to be trained in the skills and in the trades that we once used to do in this country. We should get back to some of that. We should encourage that, quite frankly, even before the college level. Why can't we graduate kids from high school with an industry certification in a career or in a trade? So when they graduate high school, they get a diploma and they're industry certified to go to work. We have examples of that on a smaller scale in South Florida, where a car dealer every single year, a friend of mine down in South Florida, he actually takes high school kids and begins to train them as BMW technicians. They go to school in the morning for a couple of hours, and then they go over to the shop and they get trained. When they graduate high school, they are BMW certified technicians. Within a year after that, they can get even higher levels of accreditation, and some of them start making $35,000, $40,000 a year to start out of high school. Why aren't we doing more of that? Instead of leaving kids trapped, they feel like, you know, I'm studying stuff I don't like and doesn't speak to me. They drop out of high school. They languish in the economy for 10 or 15 years, and then sometimes they'll find themselves into a for-profit college or some other program to try to get them trained. Let's avoid all that. Let's allow ourselves to provide these children, these kids, these high school students and others across this country with an opportunity to study something they enjoy and they love and to get the skills so they can avoid all of that. We also have this new revolution in massive online coursework. Now, not every course can be taken that way, but we now have the ability to allow people to actually have self-directed learning, to use the internet platforms that are available. So you can take a course in political science from Harvard and economics from Yale. You can sit there and actually put your own coursework together. This is still being developed. But this is an important part of our future innovation, the ability to bring the classroom and the learning experience to the student, not just require them to sit for lectures for an hour and a half in a classroom when they could easily get the lecture online. And it can be tailored to their schedule, to their workload, to their needs. Beyond that, you see innovations in terms of giving people credit for work experience or life experience. You see colleges are doing that now, where you can go in and you can say, this is what I've done for the last 20 years of my life, and you get credit for that work because you have life experience and work experience in a field. They don't just make you sit there and spend a bunch of money on electives that you're never going to use and don't really need because, quote, they want you to be well-rounded, unquote. But all it does, in fact, is drive up the cost of your education. I don't know about you, but in the last years of my 4-year degree, I was searching for electives to take because I had to have electives. I don't even remember what some of those electives were, but I paid for them. I paid for them with student loans and Pell Grants. I would much rather have just gotten my degree in the things I needed to know so that I could have moved on to law school and do that there. These are some of the ideas that we have in terms of how we should revolutionize our higher ed system to reflect the needs and the realities of the 21st century. The fact of the matter is we have a challenge before us now unlike anything we've ever had. Industries are now evolving on a yearly basis. Most Americans are going to have to be retrained at some point in their lives on a new skill because that's just the pace of change. And we need to have the infrastructure in place to provide that for people in a way that's affordable. In a way that's affordable. It reminds me of the story of a friend that I had. It was one of the parents on one of my son's teams. And the mom, you know, she was always struggling because she was always the first one to get laid off at her office. She worked primarily as a receptionist at a dental clinic or a medical clinic, got a little bit into billing. But what she really needs to become, and what she really would like to become, is an ultrasound technician. is an ultrasound technician, so she can make a little bit more money, have more job security, and provide her kids with the opportunities she wants them to have. The problem that she has is she has to work 8 hours during the day. How is she going to do that and then go to school and get that training? And I'm telling you, in many parts of this country, we do not have the infrastructure in place for that to happen, and our financial aid programs, both on the loan side and on the Pell Grant side, do not provide the flexibility for them to be able to do that in the most cost-effective way. To that end, by the way, I've proposed a number of pieces of legislation. Most of them are bipartisan. I've worked with Senator Wyden and others on the Student Right to Know Before You Go Act. That basically means that before you take out these loans, you're going to be provided meaningful information on this is how much it's going to cost to go to school here, this is how much people that graduate with this degree from this college make when they graduate, and this is how much you're going to owe. You can still take the course, you can still major in that, but you deserve to know. You deserve to know that if you're going to owe $20,000 and you're only going to make $20,000 a year when you graduate with this degree, it's going to take you a long time to pay it, if ever. Students have a right to know before you go. That's the Student Right to Know Before You Go Act. I've also offered legislation last week, the Higher Education and Skills Obtainment Act, which will create one universal tax credit for higher education, and it will produce measurable savings, some of which can be redirected to the shortfalls in the Pell Grant program that are coming up. The bill basically offers one tax credit for students who are most in need, giving students the ability to avoid navigating a confusing maze of temporary tax provisions worth different amounts for different income thresholds. And by the way, people involved in job skill training would also have access to this universal credit, as opposed to all these different credits that are floating out there now that people don't fully understand how to use. There are other ideas that we've proposed. I've introduced legislation with Senator Coons that provides an innovative partnership that will create an interactive source of information for students to be able to create college savings accounts. Studies have shown that American children with college savings accounts in their name are 7 times more likely to go to college than students without one. This bill will combine innovative student support tools with savings accounts to promote access for low-income students in our country, to be able to put some money aside to be able to do this. Fact of the matter is that today's 21st century student requires a higher education system that best suits their needs, whether that's in the form of a traditional university, a community college, a career or technical education, workforce retraining programs, or a combination of all of these things. And I'm not saying this is not an important debate to have, because it is. It's facing people right now. But I hope at some point we will look at our student aid programs and what we can do to tailor them to the 21st century, to all of the innovations that are now available to us to allow people to gain the knowledge they need to become competitive in a 21st century economy. And that's going to require, in my opinion, a significant restructuring in how our higher education is developed. This is not a threat to liberal arts college or traditional four-year educations. That will always be part of our system. It's an important part of our system. But that doesn't work for everybody. Not because they're not smart enough, but because they have a job during the day, because they're raising 3 kids. If you're a single mom with 3 kids and a full-time job, you can't just leave all that behind and go to Gainesville, Florida, to the University of Florida for 4 years. You need the ability to be able to get that degree that allows you to do it. I lived that. My sister had to do that. She went back to school in her 30s and finished her college degree and then got her master's to become a teacher. And today, she's an assistant principal, all the while raising 2 boys on her own. She would not have been able to do that if the only choice she had available to her was the University of Florida or Florida State, because you can't just move. That doesn't work for someone in that part of their lives. We need to have answers to this. And so I hope that we will spend some time focusing on what we can do in reforming the way we accredit colleges, particularly when it comes to student financial aid, and in the way we structure our financial aid programs, so that the education system meets the needs of our 21st century students and not the other way around. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
The Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I understand the senator from Maine is going to go next, but I would ask unanimous consent that the time until 5 p.m. be equally divided and controlled between the 2 leaders or their designees, and that the senators be permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, and that any time and quorum be equally divided between the Democrats and Republicans.
Without objection. The Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's okay. Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to talk about an issue that we are all very concerned about, particularly my home state of New Hampshire, and that is the rising student loan rates. In fact, one study that looked at it for the class of 2011 found that from New Hampshire, the average load of debt from the class of 2011 was over $32,000. I, like the senator from Florida, have experienced it personally as well. I wouldn't have been able to get a law degree or have the education that I've had without the ability to take out student loans, and only paid them off, fortunately, right as we had our first child. And so this was something that basically I used to call it, I had a mortgage to pay off my student loans. But I was grateful for the opportunity to get those loans and to get the education that I was able to receive. And we want to make sure that all students are able to pursue higher education in the most affordable way possible. But here's where we are today. This is such a complete, typical Washington deal. Here we just voted on a proposal on the floor, and that proposal is a one-year fix, only applies to 40% of student loans. So we'd be back again next year, like Groundhog Day, trying to fix this problem again. And it's a complete Washington deal in this way. There actually has been a bipartisan proposal that has members of both parties have come together. What happened is we saw that the president put forward a proposal as to how to deal with the increase in rates on July 1st. The House Republicans had a proposal on how to deal with those rates. I was with Secretary Duncan during a hearing, and I asked him about that, and he said, well, they aren't too far apart. Can't we come together? And there was an opportunity for compromise, and as a result, a group of senators got together here, and I want to commend them. I want to commend Senators Manchin, Alexander, Senator Burr, Senator Carper, Senator Coburn, Senator King, that they sat down and came up with a permanent solution to try to make sure that student loan rates wouldn't rise where they are right now. This solution, of course, would decrease the rates for almost every student and put a cap on consolidated loans, and also, most importantly, not a one-year fix, that we're back here again like Groundhog Day, putting students and parents in a very difficult situation of not knowing how to plan, and educational institutions, everyone in a tough situation of not knowing what's going to happen and thinking that they are facing a dramatic increase in student loan rates. So I think the American people are very tired of what happens here and the gamesmanship played in Washington. And here's the unfortunate thing. We had the vote of the one-year fix. And by the way, I thought the Washington Post addressed that one-year fix very well this morning in its editorial, where it said that lawmakers should reject this pathetic non-solution and put their efforts instead to finalizing a compromise plan. Well, there was a compromise plan that senators from both sides of the aisle have worked on. I'm a proud co-sponsor of that plan, and yet we're not being offered a vote on that plan. That's why I say this is a typical Washington deal. I can understand why the American people would be so frustrated that a bipartisan proposal that would prevent the loan rates from doubling would not receive a vote on the floor of the United States Senate. A proposal where senators from both sides of the aisle have tried to take what the president wanted, take what was done by the House Republicans, and come up with a very reasonable agreement that is a solution that doesn't just leave us here in the same position next year, doesn't just address 40% of student loans, but addresses all student loans and puts us in a situation where we would have a solution that would be bipartisan, would give students certainty, would make sure that their rates aren't doubling as they did on July 1st, and yet it doesn't even receive a vote on the floor of the United States Senate. That's what's wrong with Washington. And I would hope that the majority leader would reconsider. He may not like the proposal, I understand, but to not give it a vote on the floor of the United States Senate, where it has bipartisan support, is absolutely wrong. It deserves a vote. It deserves a thoughtful vote, given that it has bipartisan support, and it is very close to the proposal that was put forward by the President of the United States. So I would hope we would end the gamesmanship on this important issue, that we could address it, that bipartisan proposals like the one that I just talked about would get a vote on the floor of the United States Senate, and that we would resolve this issue on behalf of students, making sure, and parents as well, who I know this is causing a lot of unnecessary consternation for them. And to not give a proposal that has bipartisan support a vote at a minimum, to me, seems just wrong, and it's what's wrong with Washington. So I hope the Majority Leader would at least give it the vote that it deserves, and I hope that we can come to an agreement on this important issue. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I take this time to speak on the floor of the United States Senate to express my disappointment in last week's district court decision on the Cardin-Lugar provision of on the SEC rule. An amendment offered by Senator Lugar and I on the Dodd-Frank legislation imposed certain transparencies on extractive industries. It was a pretty simple provision. It said that those companies that are registered on the SEC that are involved in extraction of minerals would be required to disclose on a project-by-project basis the details of those contracts. We did that for many reasons. We did it because we thought transparency is right. We did it in order to deal with energy security so that we know the type of contracts that are being entered into. We did it so investors would have information in order to decide whether they wanted to invest in the stock. And the United States has been on the forefront of transparency, and this decision will delay implementation of a vital transparency rule that will shine much-needed sunlight on information designed to protect investors and to promote U.S. energy security. The Cardin-Lugar Amendment and the SEC rule are critical to achieving important U.S. policy objectives. These objectives include protecting the United States' interests in both national and energy security. Now, why do I say that? Well, by having transparency on what the extractive industries are doing, it makes it more likely that we'll have stable energy sources globally. Stable energy sources are critically important to our national security interests. These provisions are important for our national security. It also ensures investors' awareness and protection. If you're going to invest in a stock of an oil company or another mineral company, you have the right to know where they're doing business. You have the right to know what countries they're doing business and the specific contracts that they entered into. So you can make the right decision as an investor. That's why the SEC rules make sense. And lastly, it promotes American core principles of transparency, integrity, and good governance worldwide. It's interesting, we sometimes talk about the mineral wealth of a country as being a resource curse. Because although they have wealth, that wealth is taken by the elite of the country and used to finance corruption, adding to the misery of the people. So some of the wealthiest nations that exist, as far as minerals are concerned, have some of the greatest poverty in the world. Well, the provision that Senator Lugar and I co-authored was an attempt to deal with that and to deal with good governance. If we can trace the money, we have a better chance to end corruption, to develop good governance and more stable regimes. The district court ruling of API versus SEC that sends the rule back to the SEC is disappointing. The rule is flawed because the court completely misread not only the statute, but the clear congressional desire of the statute. The statute provision was for transparency. And yet the SEC, the court's ruling strikes down the SEC rule that implements that transparency. The courts spent a tremendous amount of time addressing the issue of public disclosure of the company reports. The whole purpose of Section 1504 is to provide transparency to investors and citizens about payments made to government. Why would Congress write a law to increase transparency for investors and then allow the SEC to keep these reports secret? Congress was clear in the letter and the spirit of the law that this information should be in the public domain. On the issue of the host country exception, over the very lengthy comment period for the rule of the SEC was not presented with one concrete example from industry about a specific law or contract that would prohibit these types of disclosures. In fact, examples are to the contrary, including the fact that companies such as Norwegian oil giant Statoil regularly reports their payments to countries like Angola and China, where industry says prohibits such disclosure, yet that company had no negative repercussions. The API is trying to muddy the waters by having the SEC address problems that the industry has failed to prove exist. The United States has been a leader on transparency in the extractive industries. And it's the district court that has now put a hurdle on that transparency. That the district court decision is not only contrary to the law, it's contrary to what is happening globally today. The EU has already enacted a law requiring the same payment disclosure that Section 1504 requires on a project and company level without exceptions. And at its summit last month, the G8 issued a communique unequivocally backing mandatory disclosure. Canada has said it will develop mandatory disclosures in 2 years, and the Canadian mining industry endorsed that provision. Despite the oil companies' continued fight in the U.S. court, the overwhelming momentum is on the side of mandatory disclosure. Why? Because of national security. Why? Because investors have a right to know. Why? Because it's the right thing for good governance. Despite this setback, let me make it clear, we will not give up. This law still stands, and the SEC has many options to appeal the decision or revise the rule. The SEC must make sure that it finishes the job. As Senator Levin and Senator Lugar and I stated in our amicus brief in this case, resource companies can believe whatever they wish and make whatever communications they wish about their payments to foreign governments. The resource curse or the benefit or cost of transparency, they have done so throughout the process. What resource companies may not do is impede the power of the legislative branch to require disclosure of objective information to fulfill compelling public policy objectives, including the strengthening of America's national and energy security and investor protections. Madam President, it's exactly what that provision did. Congress exercised its right as the legislative branch to require transparency for good public reasons. Members of Congress and administration on a bipartisan basis have long supported transparency through comprehensive disclosure of payments made by resource companies. That support will continue as we work with the SEC to implement this important law. Madam President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.